Hey there, internet friends. Trevor Starkey here with another episode of Trevor Trove Gaming, my weekly Sunday show where I talk about video games. This week, I'm doing a review, a spoiler-free review of Hellblade: Senua's story. So when 2017 comes to a close, it wouldn't surprise me if this game ends up as, like, the biggest surprise of 2017 on a lot of people's lists, myself included. Like, I remember it being announced back at Gamescom in 2014, and then pretty much, like, nothing until a couple weeks ago when it started kind of like popping back up, like, oh hey, this game's almost out. And it's probably something I would have skipped by had buzz not been kind of as positive as it was about it. I didn't play Heavenly Sword, I never got around to that, and DMC Devil May Cry, so this is really my first experience with a Ninja Theory game. And it is a very hauntingly powerful, eerie, beautiful experience. So the broad strokes of the story of Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is you're playing as the titular character Senua, who's a young Norse warrior woman on a personal quest to kind of avenge her beloved. And to do so, she basically has to fight into the underworld itself. Fight, god creatures of Norse mythology, as well as just kind of a general set of warrior men throughout her adventure. What sets Senua apart, though, from your typical kind of protagonist from an action-adventure game is that she suffers from severe psychosis. She's got voices in her head that she's constantly that are basically constantly at war with each other and her. So, of course, that kind of made her an outcast in her tribe, in the world, with even her father basically insisting that she's a victim to the darkness, and that the darkness is kind of taking control of her and her mind. And the voices themselves are pretty much ever present in the game. They'll be commenting on things as you walk through the landscapes of the world. They might kind of tease hints with the puzzles in the game. Even in combat, they'll come in and you'll kind of be locked into combat with one character, and you can't really get a good sense of the battlefield around you, but the voices in your head, if somebody's behind you, will say look out or watch out behind you or something like that. So it they play into the mechanics of the game in a very clever way, I think. So effectively, Senua's perceived weakness in having these voices that she's struggling with ends up actually becoming kind of a strength of hers in the game. So gameplay itself, as I touched on, there's a combat element where you'll be kind of fighting off enemies you'll walk into a little arena, and then enemies will start popping up, and you'll kind of have to fight through them to proceed through the game. And it starts out pretty simple with one or two enemies kind of here and there that you just kind of have to hack and slash your way through. But then as the game progresses, new types of enemies will get introduced. You'll have heavy enemies that'll get introduced, a shielded enemy, that kind of stuff, and they'll have different tactics themselves. So you kind of have to switch up your moveset, and your moveset is very, in its simplest terms, you've got basically like a quick attack, a heavy attack, a melee attack that can kind of stun your enemies. You can block with your sword, and you can like dash out of the way or roll out of the way or something in combat. And that's about it. You do get the ability to use a focus attack later in the game that kind of gets built up, and you can kind of unleash, and that basically turns into like a slow motion kind of attack, so your enemies kind of slow down, and you can kind of do a flurry attack to do some damage while they're kind of slowed down, and kind of regain your momentum and strength. The other main element of the game is puzzle solving. There are a lot of environmental puzzles within the game. The most frequent one that you're going to come across is basically like you'll come up to a door and it will have runes on the door that you kind of have to then find in the surrounding area. So you might have a rune of like an M or something on the door, and you'll kind of backtrack a little bit, and when it's not too difficult. You'll know when you're in the area of that rune because Senua will start to see M's all over floating around in the kind of the vicinity, and then you'll just kind of look around, and maybe you look over there, and sure enough, on the wall is basically an M that's created, or that's that's been created by the shadows of tree branches in the sunlight or something like that. So you just kind of focus in on that M, and then the door unlocks and you can proceed through the story. There are a couple other kind of puzzles that get kind of introduced later on in the game, but they all, for the most part, I think, involve kind of environmental puzzle solving. You have to find something in the environment, whether it be like a specific perspective, or there is a little bit of like there's a puzzle that like involves kind of jumping between a past and a present location, and kind of you have to change something in the past to adjust the present, or vice versa. But for the most part, like they're pretty simple, I think, puzzle mechanics. They'll make you kind of look around the world, but they're not going to be huge head scratchers, I don't think. At least they weren't for me. If anything, the ease of these puzzles and sometimes the ease of combat might be a little bit of weakness. It didn't really bother me. I always felt like I very satisfied when I got out of a battle, or when I got out of when I solved like one of these puzzles. The one thing that really kind of maybe did drag things down a little bit for me is going to be the pacing. I think the pacing at times struggles a little bit. There's a lot of kind of dead air where you're traveling from, maybe a combat arena into a spot where you have to do some puzzle solving. That is kind of slow, and even if you're like holding the L1 button to kind of run, you're not really running. You're just kind of like power walking, maybe. So there's a little bit of that, and then you also kind of have to backtrack through a lot of these areas at times with little happening. So there's that pacing issue, as well as just kind of the overall balance of combat and puzzle solving sometimes is very uneven. Most notably, I think kind of in the game's second act, there's a long stretch of period where you're just doing a variety of puzzles, and then as if to make up for that, the game basically gives you an extended combat sequence as well. So you don't get kind of a nice, okay, I'm going to do a couple puzzles and then do fighting. It's really heavy with one and then really heavy with the other, and so it kind of feels very like the scales are out of balance in that chunk of the game. But that's very nitpicky, and overall, it certainly wasn't a deal breaker for me. I've played through the game twice now, and it's something worth mentioning, but I don't think it should keep you from exploring this game. The performances in Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice are phenomenal throughout. Everybody, there aren't like many characters in this game, and pretty much all of them are told through like some kind of like FMV video like overlay kind of stuff. There's very few like characters that you're ever really interacting with in the game, but I would say that Melina Jurgens, the person who plays Senua, deserves very special accolades. I think she knocks it out of the park in the role. She's expertly juggling, playing the character's strengths as well as her vulnerabilities. At the same time, she can be a fierce warrior and also just struggling with these voices in her head and frightened by these demons. There are a lot of moments that she looks directly at the camera, to you, the player, and they're often tied to kind of a moment in a cutscene where maybe she's talking to her father, who's very disappointed with her or something like that, and you're basically serving as the stand-in for those characters. It's a very kind of unsettling moment to have the character basically putting this stuff on you, the player, so directly like that. It's not something we see too much in kind of the medium, the action adventure medium of video games, and every time they use it here, it's a sharp, strong moment that really just kind of stood out as like something very interesting to me, something visually interesting and an interesting choice in terms of like direction of the scenes. Also worth mentioning with regard to performances is the sound design of the game. The game recommends that you play with headphones on, and I wholeheartedly agree with that recommendation. The game really plays with its stereoscopic audio design, so with the headphones on, you are hearing the voices that Senua is hearing as if they're in your own head. And so you'll have, a voice over here kind of talking to you, and then it might move over to this way, and you get that with headphones that you don't necessarily get listening to a speaker or a soundbar. And sometimes the voices are contradicting one another, and sometimes they are telling you to watch out, like in combat, as I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they're whispering that you're going the wrong way, which you may or may not be. They don't really know all the time. Sometimes one will say you're going the wrong way, and somebody else will say, no, she's not, she's fine, or something like that. And it's really powerful having that through the headphone experience that just doesn't translate as well coming out of speakers or a soundbar or something like that. So I highly recommend experiencing the game that way if you can. Finally, I just want to touch on the fact that the Ninja Theory has kind of made a point about how they really dedicated the time and work with talking with neuroscientists and mental health experts to really explore the idea of psychosis through Senua's story, and I think that has led to an incredibly powerful experience in gaming this year, and it elevates what might have otherwise been just kind of a more run-of-the-mill action-adventure hack-and-slash type game. Senua winds up being, I think, one of the strongest and most complex characters we've had, certainly this year in gaming, if not in all of gaming in the entirety of the medium. So if Ninja Theory ever decides that they want to continue exploring Senua and her story, I will be very eager to go on that journey. So those are my thoughts on Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. You can read the full review over at Trevor Trove or at the link in the description below. As always, I've been your host, Trevor Starkey. You can follow me at SnarkyStarkey on Twitter. Let me know what you think about the game in the comments below. And until next time, from here at the Trove, treasure your friends.